So before you do an assessment, you want to think about how many of you ever had test anxiety, right? You come into the room, you're already anxious, or you had a test right after you got some bad news, or you ever had a test after you skipped breakfast and you're hungry and starving. Maybe for whatever reason you had a test and they were doing construction next door. All of those things are distracting. They give you more anxiety, and you're probably not going to have your best performance. So as the assessor, you want to make sure to the greatest extent possible that you control the things in the environment. And if there are some things that happen that are out of your control, be sensitive to that, right? If a kid comes in and they're looking really sad and down, and this is usually a happy kid, take a minute to talk to them and see what's going on, see if you can encourage them in any way before you start, or see if this test needs to happen on a different day. If somebody just had an injury the day before, they're not going to perform well on a physical test, right? So maybe this is a test we wait for later. So think about those things and how you can meet those needs. And if you can't meet the needs, how can you be considerate of those things? You also want to make sure on the day of the assessment that you are prepared, right? That's the absolute worst thing, is to show up for an assessment and the teacher is not prepared, therapist not prepared. You want to have a printout of the rubric that you're using. A rubric is just a tool for assessment. So it might be a check sheet that says, like, if we're going to measure accuracy of throwing, we might check off how many times they hit the goal and how many times they missed, or even if you were doing darts, then you would put like how many times they hit each number. So something like that, a criteria. If we're looking at technique, which is mostly what we're going to do in this class, then you have a sheet that tells you they didn't step, they stepped with their same foot that they threw with, they stepped with the opposite foot of the hand that they threw with. You have checks for those things. Okay, so you want to have that with you, and that makes sure that you're using an objective assessment. You want to have the equipment already there and set up. You don't want somebody to show up for an assessment and you have to spend 10 minutes setting up after they get there. That's a waste of their time. You want to know how to do the assessment before they arrive. You don't want the first time you look at the instructions to be when you're actually in the middle of giving the assessment. That's not going to work. It's not going to go well. They're probably going to perform bad on the test just because you didn't know what you were doing. So make sure you practice the steps and go through the instructions before they arrive. While you're collecting data, it would be a good idea for you to videotape it. Sometimes it's just hard to see when you're looking at it. You're trying to write and look at them at the same time. They may be talking to you. There may be some other distractions. So if you videotape, then you can always go back and look at the video when you're going through your notes and make sure that you assessed correctly. And even for you, wherever you stand, you want to make sure that you have an appropriate vantage point, and wherever the camera is needs to have an appropriate vantage point. So most of our motor skills, so throwing, kicking, are in the sagittal plane. So that's right in front of you. So if you were to take a line and to divide yourself into right and left hemispheres, that is the plane of movement that most of our movements occur in. So if that is the type of movement that you're looking at, you want to be actually on the side. You want to be perpendicular to the plane of movement. Okay, so if you're looking at throwing performance and you want to be able to see the wind up through execution to the follow through, then you're going to need to be on the side of them to be able to see that. If you're looking at accuracy, you might want to be in front of them or near the goal, the target. If you're actually looking at something that is happening in the back, so you may be looking for something more specific, then you want to be able to see the back. So you want to think about what you're looking at and what you're looking for to decide an appropriate vantage point. And then when you're doing the assessment, let's say instead of technique, you're looking at accuracy, or maybe so number of times you hit the target or number of points scored. Then you might look at mean and standard deviation. And hopefully you've heard these numbers before in maybe algebra or statistics, but your mean is your average. So that's if you take the sum of all the performances and divide it by the number of times they did that performance, then you would get an average. So in this case, this person scored 5 points on average. So that tells you their average performance. If you want to look at the variability, so that's important too, right? So this case that I have up here doesn't show it so much, but you can see even sometimes they made 9 and sometimes they had 2, and so they ended up with a 5. So maybe you may have a person that, let's say you're evaluating players' performances and their first couple of games, for whatever reason, they're just having a hard time, or they were up against a strong defender. They didn't score at all. So you have some zeros in there, but then the rest of their performances were really good, double digits every time. Then when you average those together, those zeros are going to really bring down that performance, and it may not be very representative of their performance overall. So if you look at the standard deviation, that tells you the variability, then and the difference in the performance from the mean, and that gives you a better idea of how consistent this player is over time. And then after you do assessment, you set it up correctly, you chose the right test, you used an appropriate vantage point, you formulated your assessment into a number that is meaningful, and then you want to share the results. And if you're in a school, then you're going to share it with the student. You may share it with your administrators. You may share it with their parents. And that may be the same for physical therapy, coaching, all of those things. You're probably going to share your assessment with multiple people. But specifically for the client or the student or athlete, you want to make sure that you not only criticize, but encourage and teach. And so this is the scripture from 2 Timothy 3:16, and it's really talking about scripture. Scripture is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and encouragement. But last year when I heard the scripture, it really hit me as an instructor that I needed to do a better job of, when I correct, to make sure that I use it to teach and to encourage, and not just stay negative all the time, right? It gets a little bit overwhelming if all you ever get is negative feedback and nobody ever is telling you what you're doing well or encouraging you that you can do better. Okay, so make sure you balance the positive and the negative when you are giving results of tests.